So, Pokemon Legends ZA came out recently, and from the looks of it, it's not doing too great, nor does it look too great. It could be the worst game in the franchise. By the way, thank you all for liking that Hawlucha video so much. It's the highest rated video on the channel, so big thanks for that. However, today we're going to be talking about a fellow Legends game that I think is the best Pokemon game in the franchise and is one of the only games that has a proper battle system that I wish the rest of the series inherited. But that game would be Pokemon Legends ARCEUS. So, with that being said, when you're talking about Pokemon spin-off games, especially those that are RPG games that take for the main series, so your Pokemon Stadium, your Stadium 2, your Pokemon Coliseum, your Pokemon XD Gale of Darkness, all of them don't really change the battle system from what is normally known from the main series, right? But Pokemon Legends ARCEUS, or PLA, did something quite different. They changed two classic status conditions, Freeze and Sleep, to Frostbite and Drowsy. Not the Pokemon Drowsy. This is a different type of drowsy, the literal definition of being drowsy. With that being said, the reason why I think this was the best move is because Freeze and Sleep classically have always been the most useless status conditions in the franchise, because from Generation 1 onward, even though the rules have changed and abilities alter the effects of these status conditions for the most part, the main problem is that they prevent the opponent from playing the game. That's not good and doesn't really add to the battle system as a whole. This is especially bad for Sleep because Sleep can be inflicted with so many moves, whereas Freeze has always been a side effect of most ice moves. So, with that being said too, the reason why Drowsy is better than Sleep is because Drowsy actually allows the opponent to play the game, unlike Sleep, because Drowsy still allows the Pokemon to fight, but there is a chance that they could fail once per turn. So, with that being said, it works in a similar way to something like Confusion, but instead of having the chance of the Pokemon hitting itself once per turn, the Pokemon would just fail to act once per turn. This too adds on to other strategies, because when it is snowing, the Pokemon is less likely to act during that turn. So that's a good strategy for a weather team. But what's also quite interesting about Drowsy is that it can be cured more easily than Sleep, because if a Pokemon uses Spark, Volt Tackle, or Wild Charge, this will cure the user's drowsiness. So there's a way to actually break out of it. So with that being said, I think that's way fairer. But the interesting addition to Drowsy is that Pokemon take increased damage while under this status condition, which also makes it a very good way to take out those who are a bit more bulkier. So overall, I think Drowsy adds more to the game than Sleep. Speaking about drowsy Pokemon, trick that like and subscribe button like drowsy Pokemon and hit it really hard. Only once though. Only need you to hit them once. Thank you so much. Let's continue. But now let's talk about Freeze and its PLA counterpart, Frostbite. So, Freeze has always been a very dangerous status condition because it acts at random. Unlike Sleep, even though both of them stop you from playing the game, Sleep has moves that automatically trigger the status condition, so you know what you're in for when the opponent uses the move. However, Freeze has always been attached to a side effect of a % chance of a variety of ice moves causing the status effect to happen. So, when the opponent uses a select ice move, there's always a chance that that ice move could cause you to freeze. That's why it puts so much anxiety on the idea of the opponent using an ice move. because there's no real way of knowing if you're going to be frozen by that ice move or not. With that being said, this is worse in Gen 1 because unless you used an item, you couldn't thaw out from being frozen. Now this improves in Generation 2, where there's a 10% chance of thawing out naturally, and this increases from Generation 3 onwards to 20%. And of course, you cannot be frozen in harsh sunlight caused by a sunny day or the ability drought. But in addition, thawing can occur via the use of a select number of fire and water moves such as Flare, Blitz, and Scald. But the reason why Frostbite is leaps and bounds better than Freeze is because it attacks those who use the special attack stat. If you didn't know, in Generation 4, meaning Pokemon Diamond, Pearl, Heart Gold, Soul Silver, and Platinum, there was a thing called the special physical split. So in Pokemon, there are 3 types of damage categories: physical, special, and status. Status is the odd man out here because status just initiates an effect on the opponent. And whether they're immune to that effect or not could depend on ability or type. However, when you're talking about physical attacks always factor in the attack stat of the attacking Pokemon and the defense stat of the defending Pokemon. However, special is different because special in Generation 1 was actually a singular stat, and that stat dictated the attack and the defense of special moves. So the attacking Pokemon used the special stat and the defending Pokemon used the special stat. However, in generations later, this special stat was split into 2 different stats: special attack and special defense. Special attack was used to determine the offensive power of the attacking Pokemon, and then the special defense stat was used to determine how well the defending Pokemon would take that attack. So with that being said, in generations 1 through 3, moves were tied to damage categories depending on the type of attack that they were. So all fire moves were considered special. All water moves were considered special. However, all ghost and poison moves, for example, were considered physical. This changed in Gen 4, and now all attacks of all damaging types can be either physical or special. They're no longer tied to the type of attack that they are. But with that being said, the special attackers are the cream of the crop because there's nothing that can actually slow them down. There's no status conditions specifically made in the mainline series that hinder their effectiveness. The only thing that hinders a special attacker's effectiveness are moves. There are moves like Snarl that specifically attack the offensive stats, but then special attackers can hinder themselves after blowing up your team with moves like Draco Meteor or Overheat that lower the special attack stat after they are used. So the only enemy to the special attacker is themselves most of the time. This is bad because physical attackers do not get the same treatment. Physical attackers for the longest time have always been beat up by the status condition known as Burn, which has the attack stat. Now, fire Pokemon are immune to being burned, but there are very few of them that are actually physical attackers. So the problem solves itself in that way. But with that being said, special type attackers usually don't get the same treatment. However, in Pokemon Legends Arceus, this changes because there is a status condition called Frostbite. Frostbite actually lowers the damage of special moves, meaning moves that use the special attack stat. This is the first and only time that special attackers have been affected in any significant way. And like Burn, Frostbite does do 1/16 of the target's HP over time. But ice Pokemon are immune to being frostbitten, much like how fire Pokemon are immune to being burned. But still, the fact that there's something in place to slow the progression of special attackers is important and I think is needed for game balance. Because, like I said previously, special attackers usually run the show because there's nothing in the way that actually slows them down from blowing up your team unless you pick them off. With that being said, what's also quite interesting about Frostbite as opposed to Freeze is because now, if Frostbite was implemented more regularly in the main series, you could play with it a lot more like they do with Burn, because there's an ability called Flame Body that causes a burn when a Pokemon makes physical contact with that Pokemon. So you could do the same thing for a Frostbite. Maybe if somebody targets a ice Pokemon with a special attack, there's a chance they could get frostbitten. Or if they make physical contact with a Pokemon, they get frostbitten. Perhaps this could be an improvement on the already existing ability called Ice Body. But with that being said too, this could be a big improvement for the Ice type, because right now they are the biggest punching bag in the Pokemon franchise. I see this as a similar boon that Steel and Poison got when the Fairy type was introduced, because now there's something for them to beat up on, whereas previously there really wasn't any use for them. But with that being said, that's all I have for you today. I do hope they add Frostbite into more games, because that's overall more efficient to the game and the gaming experience overall than Freeze. But stay rosy.